Putin has entrenched himself. The best way for him to be defeated is probably to be defeated on the battlefield, and that may lead to a triggering event, and it is that triggering event that needs to happen in Moscow politically. That is the best way to defeat them. If in the interim we can't defeat them militarily, which I don't think we can in 2024, but again, I think the notion of how you defeat them militarily in terms of cutting their lines of communication and isolating Crimea is still there on the books at some time.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking once again about the war in Ukraine with Major General Chapman. Chip is a former British military advisor to US Central Command who served for 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a commentator on geopolitics and security and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. General Chapman, as ever, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon, James.
Let's start with the big news of the week in terms of what's happening on the front line, which is obviously the situation in Avdiivka. Russia has now captured the town. Ukraine has withdrawn from it. How much significance would you place on that?
Well, let's place Avdiivka in context that this is another mother of all battles, which was fought from October until about the 18th of February. In the same way that Bakhmut last May, when it fell, was also a mother of all battles. But battles are just tactical things, and they're sequenced in support of operational objectives to further strategic ends. So it's really whether it progresses Russia towards an operational end. Now, both Bakhmut and Avdiivka are in Donetsk Oblast, which they originally, of course, invaded with their little green men in 2014, and they've still not captured the whole thing. The real so what from Avdiivka is it's the first major victory from Bakhmut, and it gives Russia a gateway now with Bakhmut and Avdiivka that it opens a way for potentially a large encirclement. I don't think they've got the capability to do this to the bigger cities in Donetsk, particularly Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, and they could threaten Povrovsk, which is 80 kilometers away to the west. But 80 kilometers in this war is a long way, with people really moving at a glacial rate. Now, the rate of movement in Avdiivka has been slightly quicker than the norm. And there are really four reasons for that, really. The first one is the manpower advantage that they had over the Ukrainians. So when in September, there were 37 Russian sort of units there and 34 Ukrainian defending. And by February, that had gone up to 95 for the Russians and only 56 for the Ukrainians. So the mobilization and Russia and rotation issue is absolutely more profound at the moment for the Ukrainians than it is for the Russians. And of course, although people say that there's a new character of war with drones and electronic warfare, which there is to a certain extent, mass still matters. And that combat ratios which the Russians amassed, not just with that manpower, but secondly with their artillery advantage, which was 5-1, and thirdly the air disparity, because they were able to bring close air support to bear. And it's worth also mentioning that in the 20th century, one of the four key factors of success in land operations was control of the air. And certainly it seems that close air support around Avdiivka meant that the Russians controlled that air, due to the fourth thing, which was significant, I think, here, which was the constraints on the Ukrainian air defense. Now, they may have got over that since Avdiivka fell, with the fact that 7 Su-34s have been downed in that period. And that could be a tactic for the Ukrainians trying to push the Russian A2AD back. By that we mean the anti-access area denial, making it more difficult for close air support for any follow-up operations which the Russians might need to do. That is, this has been a tactical success, but it is not an operational breakthrough. It is that which would be significant if this really were to turn into something. But from a morale perspective with the Russians, I think probably last June, or when we thought the Ukrainian offensive was taking place, the Russians probably thought to themselves at the time, can we hold them? Now they're probably thinking to themselves, can the Ukrainians hold us? And one of their subsequent objectives, really down in Zaporizhia, I think, is going to be Robertine to try and capture that territory that they lost there. That would be sort of significant in a morale sense, because that was 13 miles north of Tokmak, and it was Tokmak which, of course, needed to be the pivot in mid 23 if the Ukrainians were to succeed in cutting off the Russian lines of communications which flowed to Crimea.
And how would you assess Ukraine's chances of finding a new defensive line and holding it?
No, I think they can find a new defensive line, and I think they can probably hold it, because it is this glacial amount that people can move, which is really slowing the war down. And this, again, is one of these characteristics of war which people have kind of got wrapped around the axle about. And that is that, of course, due to modern targeting techniques and the fact that data processing can move at the speed of light, people think that that means that you can move at the speed of light. But actually, the reverse has really taken place, that the sort of what we might think of as the mill tech complex and the use of this data processing and a lot of civil technologies, Starlink, Palantir, Maxar, Capella Space, these have meant that it's the ability to move which is really being constrained. And although the Ukrainians have this deficit in all those areas that I mentioned, partly because of the stasis in the House of Representatives with the Americans, they are still supposedly in 2024 producing 1 million drones, first-person view drones. And that is something which, again, in terms of the democratization of the air, will stop the Russians moving in large numbers, chunks of kilometers towards those operational objectives that I mentioned earlier on.
Of course, one of the notable things in Russia's attempt to capture Avdiivka has been the very high casualty rate. And I just wondered to what extent you think ordinary Russians are aware of that. I mean, it was interesting this week. We've had the pro-war Russian military blogger Andrei Morozov, who's committed suicide after posting only last week on Telegram about the scale of the Russian casualties. He was then ordered to take that post down by the Kremlin, and he's decided to take his own life. But does that not illustrate the fact that Moscow is deeply worried about the casualty rate being better known?
Yeah, and I think they're worried about any influence in the public space which is against this. That is one of the reasons, for example, that Nasruddin, the only potentially independent candidate in what is really not a presidential election coming up for Putin between somewhere around the 13th to 15th of March, why he was not deemed to be a candidate who had faulty stats. He needed 100,000 signatures to get on the plate. He got over 105,000, but 15,000 of those were deemed to be fraudulent by the Kremlin, and he was dismissed by the Election Commission. So it was that he was against both the track of militarism, he was anti-war, and the track of authoritarianism, which Russia is really on. Now, as long as Russia keeps the lid on that sort of rebelliousness against that, and they have in terms of Navalny, the fact that only 400 people have been kind of arrested since he died just shows you that he's entrenched authoritarian institutions and practices in Putin 4.0, which he'll continue to do when he inevitably wins the election at Putin 5.0, which by the end of which, of course, he'll have been in power longer than Stalin and probably as ruthless as Stalin.
And of course, it's interesting the criticism that sometimes Russia receives from its own side, from ultra-nationalist, pro-war military bloggers. And there's been criticism in that sphere this week about the Ukrainian HIMARS strike that hit an undefended Russian training ground in Donetsk Oblast, reportedly causing significant casualties, potentially up to 60, although that's not confirmed. Are Russia's defences away from the front line strong enough, would you say?
Well, I think that really proves the point I was making a couple of minutes ago about the transparency of the battlefield, both in terms of the close battle and what we would term to be the deep battle away from the contact area, because of the nature of commercialization and the fact that targeting is almost ubiquitous with the use of drones and satellites. So it is very difficult to hide yourself, and that is why force protection is always deemed to be a responsibility, not a mission. Now, the Russians, it seems, from their deep battle perspective at the moment, are trying to not go as they did in the winter of 2023 against the sort of energy infrastructure of Ukraine. They seem to be wanting more to go after the defense infrastructure of Ukraine, because Ukraine has or is building up an indigenous defense industry to produce as much of its own munitions and sinews of war as it can. On the other foot, the Ukrainian deep battle at the moment seems to be that they're targeting the oil depots and terminals of the Russians to try and make that hurt, both in terms of the bulk of that which needs to go to the front line, and it's always 60% of logistics is fuel going to the front line. So if you can interdict that or interdict the large fuel dumps, then that seems to be a sensible way to go from the Ukrainian perspective.
And on the deep battle, it's been reported this week, widely reported, that if this aid package eventually passes Congress, and let's hope it does, that one of the first things the Americans will provide to Ukraine is longer range ATACMS missiles. Obviously, they provided shorter range ones so far, but now these longer range ones. Could that be a game changer?
Well, there are no magic weapons. I think you have to go back to answer that question fully to June 22. And if you look at what happened after the sort of relief of Kyiv, there was a really critical point around June 22, which was really picked up quite well by a Republican congressman called Mike Varts. And Mike Varts is a former Green Beret. And what he said was then also articulated by Avril Haines, who's the ODNI, that's the Department of National Intelligence, who briefs the president. And what he said at the time was that Ukraine was losing slowly. Now, a phrase that Putin has used is that the chicken pecks grain by grain, and both sides, in a way, in the close battle, are trying to achieve attrition by overstretch. So the Russians are pecking grain by grain. There is this losing slowly, perhaps, mentality. That doesn't mean that they're losing big chunks of ground in a single entity, but this losing slowly analogy comes back again. Now, that was recovered in June 22 by equalizing the battlefield by those very assets that you've just mentioned there, James. That is the HIMARS, the precision strike artillery, and then obviously the coalition which brought the tanks together. Now, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to lose at the moment, because people often forget that in terms of the support from the EU, including the UK, in military terms, that adds up to $48.7 billion. The US support so far has been $46.33 billion. So it might be counterintuitive to most people, but the EU and UK military aid has been greater slightly than the American. The key thing about the Americans, of course, is the high-end capabilities, including the ATACMS, which you've mentioned, and the speed and scale with which they can get that into theatre. Now, it is true that there have been a number of bilaterals which have been agreed in the last 6 weeks between various countries and Ukraine because of the caveats on NATO accession, particularly with Germany, with France, and Ukraine and UK. So Ukraine will be kept in the fight, and they can still equalize the battlefield. But unless you have that $60 billion of US support, and the House of Representatives is still in recess until the end of the month, then they're not going to go into a position where they can absolutely stop the Russian momentum at the moment, reverse that, and go on offensive operations either in later 2024 or 2025.
Just on the ATACMS, I mean, were they to be sent, these longer range ones, to Ukraine? Do you think that signifies a change in approach in the White House? I was speaking on Frontline only this week to Major General Mick Ryan, former Australian commander, and he was sort of criticising America for being afraid of escalation for too long and saying, look, one way or another, this is going to escalate and we need to confront Putin, and it would be better to give these longer range weapons to Ukraine now than risk escalation down the line. Of course, the fear has always been from America that they'll be used in Crimea or inside Russia, and that will just provoke Putin further. But do you think now, maybe following the death of Navalny, the White House has reached the point where they think, you know what, we've got to take that risk?
I don't think there's a causal link between the death of Navalny and the provision of longer-range ATACMS. And we don't know, of course, if the ATACMS longer range absolutely means that they can be used at a longer range in Russia. There's always been 7 factors for escalation, and that can be either weapons, targets, objectives, geography, domains, i.e. cyber or space, mobilization, or by rhetoric. We often get the mobilization or the escalation by rhetoric, particularly with Medvedev about the use of nuclear weapons. ATACMS with a longer range could be deemed to be an escalation by weapons, but of course, as a military man, you'd always say, can we use these weapons for a deep strike capability at a longer range? The should we and must we are political questions to be answered, because ultimately all wars are fought for political objectives, not military objectives. And of course, that is one of the theories of victory of the Russians at the moment. It's both their second year aim, a year ago from now, and their third year aim is to find ways to divide the international community and search for those laggards within it, such as Hungary in the past year, the sort of Putin part of the Republican Party, to make sure that the Ukrainians aren't supported. Although there are two elections this year, both with Putin and the November election in America, in a way it's only the November election in America that matters, because the result in Russia is already preordained. So all those things mean that it is important that Ukraine is supported by the international community, but those are political questions ultimately, not military questions about whether they can use those longer range weapons.
Just talking of missiles, we've had the news this week as well that the UK has announced it's going to send 200 more Brimstone missiles to Ukraine. How much of a difference do you think they will make, and what more would you like to see the UK providing? What more can we provide at the moment?
Well, I think one thing that you'd really like, because we mentioned ATACMS, is you'd like the Taurus, the German equivalent of some of our missiles that we've already provided, which has the extended range equivalent to the ATACMS long-range ATACMS that we were mentioning beforehand. Now, you can take a number of approaches. So, for example, on this, it's been announced in the last week that the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has now gifted the entire artillery and ammunition stock of artillery to Ukraine, because that is the war that needs to be fought and won now. So it could be that, if you really were serious about this, you could gift, for example, all the Challenger 2 tanks and recapitalise your fleet for the future. Now, that would be a different order of magnitude of decision. If you absolutely are serious about this is a war that we cannot afford to lose for various reasons, either to do with geopolitics, geoeconomics, or the morality of how the international system works, and that aggression should not be seen to succeed, those are certain approaches that you could do. Now, of course, I don't think that's likely to happen, what I've just mentioned about giving away an entire capability from a UK perspective, but those are approaches if you cannot use your industrial might, which we should be able to do to support Ukraine properly, because the real battle at the moment is really between the arsenal of democracy and the arsenal of autocracy, and the efficiencies of how democracies work means that really we should be able to outproduce Russia by an order of magnitude if the political will is there to so do.
Just on the example of Denmark, it's really interesting you mentioned that. Do you think other smaller European nations might follow suit?
Well, I think it depends on your geographic proximity to the problem. So, for example, we know that the countries which, in terms of their GDP, give more support to Ukraine and others are those which essentially were former Soviet vassal states and sort of border Ukraine. So it's the what we call the intermarium states. It's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the way down through Poland, Romania, and out to the Black Sea. So they give a lot of their kit to them, including from their GDP. It's easier for those who are further away, like Denmark. They're not on the front line. You'd have to go through quite a number of other countries if you're a Russian, through Poland, Germany, etc.
Things have gone badly wrong if Putin gets to there.
Yeah, it would absolutely go badly wrong. And I don't think they have the capability to do that, which also is one of these reasons about all this stuff what we've heard about in the last few weeks about we're in a pre-war period. I tend to think that absolutely needs to be reversed, and that we're actually in the longest peace period since the Second World War, And if you really want to preserve that, then you should support Ukraine with just about anything it needs to ensure that Russia is defeated. That is the best way of ensuring peace in Europe for the long-term future.
That's a really interesting bit of framing, actually, there, because, one of the challenges, as you're well aware, for Western leaders at the moment, it's a challenge that Joe Biden notably is having, is how do you sell the need to continue funding expensive military aid for Ukraine to domestic voters? And, is there going to be Ukraine fatigue almost? And actually selling it not as an escalation of war, but as a preservation of peace, perhaps, is the language we need to see now from leaders.
Well, I think there are three things that one needs to do. Firstly, of course, there is a security case for supporting Ukraine, both in a geopolitical and geostrategic sense, because to diminish your most persistent threat without having a Western boot on the ground, and the fact that they might not stop because of their worldview about regain lost territory and spheres of influence, means that it's pretty efficient in a security case to support Ukraine. The second one is the economic case. People say, there's a cost of living crisis in the West, and that also is a form of framing, but it's actually quite cheap. It's 0.02% of GDP, and looking at the statistics today of what I paid on my tax and where the tax bill went. So, for example, it is 1/100th of the benefits bill in the UK that we use in supporting Ukraine per year. And my tax bill this year, 12% of it went on national debt interest and 19% went on welfare. So there's an economic case. And thirdly, the most important one is the moral case. Russia invaded Ukraine. That is wrong in the UN Charter, international law, and cannot be allowed to succeed. It must show ultimately the futility of force rather than the utility of force.
And of course, this Saturday marks the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion. This week also marks, we should say, a decade since the illegal invasion of Crimea. Just, in this week of anniversaries, what are your reflections on where we are now in the broader sense in this conflict?
Well, I think the most interesting thing of looking from a historical perspective, which sometimes I do, is that if you look at long wars, of which this is turning into a long war, a study of 200 conflicts which were long wars showed that the point where it is least likely to have either a ceasefire or negotiations is at the 2-year point. Now, it is true that Russia would probably like negotiations, but it is also true that Russia does not want to negotiate because they think from all those things about testing the resolve of the Western and international community that ultimately it is the West that will give in, and Russia doesn't want to negotiate with Ukraine. It wants to negotiate with the West because they believe that ultimately there will be those laggards there who will give in to Russia and enable them to achieve some of their objectives in the interim term, particularly in terms of what they say is the new reality in terms of their illegally annexed oblast, the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Oh, and by the way, as Medvedev said this week, we'd also like Odessa and probably Kharkiv. And there are people who would probably give in to that. They're not going to go anywhere geographically, but they cannot seize and hold that territory. There were people on day one of this war who thought that they would get to the left bank Ukraine, that is up to the Dnipro River, but they will try to disrupt and disable, and that is politically. That is how Russia would win this war, not by taking over all the geographic territory of Ukraine, because that will be impossible for them to achieve. I mean, the Donetsk Oblast, which we've really been talking about at the beginning with both Bakhmut and Avdiivka, is only 4.4% of the geographic territory of Ukraine. Ukraine is a big country, but Ukraine can be subdued by politics, not by them going right across Ukraine to the Polish border.
So from this point forward, how best do we turn the screw on Putin?
Well, Putin will only pursue peace if it's threatened with losing ground again or by internal instability. And if we can defeat his forces on the ground, then there is some chance of either a mutiny ultimately of the forces, particularly if the burden of manpower is from those eastern federal parts of the Russian Republic, or by people in the Kremlin, the elite, saying that enough is enough. Now, it takes a brave man to do that, and we didn't see much of that rumbling when Prigozhin, for example, was killed, or when Navalny was killed, because the competing elites are terrified of their own life. So, Putin has entrenched himself. The best way for him to be defeated is probably to be defeated on the battlefield, and that may lead to a triggering event, and it is that triggering event that needs to happen in Moscow politically. That is the best way to defeat them. If in the interim we can't defeat them militarily, which I don't think we can in 2024, but again, I think the notion of how you defeat them militarily in terms of cutting their lines of communication and isolating Crimea is still there on the books at some time.
Can we do more to hit Putin in the pocket? I know the former Foreign Secretary William Hague wrote in the Times this week saying he thinks we should now be spending the frozen Russian assets that were seized in 2022 when the full-scale invasion happened, potentially on military aid for Ukraine, that we may as well put that money to good use. Would that make a big difference?
I'm not sure how that works, and I'm not a sort of economist to really answer that question. What I do think is one can say is that the Russian economy and industrial potential will culminate somewhere in late 2024, and their curve, because of sanctions and other matters, is likely to be downwards from that time. So as long as the sticking power is there, then this war is likely to go on at least for another 1 to 2 years, and they still can be defeated. Whether you can do that without disrupting how the international community works via sanctions, I'm not too sure. It's not really my expertise to answer that question, I think, James.
And just finally, what would constitute a successful few months for Ukraine? We're speaking now towards the end of February. Let's say we were to speak again towards the end of April. What would be a successful few months?
Well, I think if they can hold the line, that there are no further large incursions by the Russians, that the unlocking of the aid in America, in the House of Representatives, is there, because that would be the greatest fillip in morale terms, I think, to the Ukrainians. The swift introduction of the F-16s to the Ukrainians, we think that they're going to be there by the summer. We know that there are at least 61 that have been gifted. Pilot training seems to be coming to a conclusion in Denmark by late spring and in America by early summer. Those things will all help to, as I said earlier, equalize the battlefield and start the sort of rollback process again in the summer.
Major General Chip Chapman, we always appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.